Good morning. Scripture readings for today are from Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, and then Genesis chapter 32, verses 22 through 32, which can be found on pages 8 and 26 of your pew Bibles. Verse 12, chapter 12. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the ones who curse you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Chapter 32, verses 22 through 32. The same night he got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans, and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And then he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. Therefore to this day the Israelites do not eat the thigh muscle that is on the hip socket, because he struck Jacob on the hip socket at the thigh muscle. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. So wrestling was a huge sport in my high school growing up. We had Johnny Burdick, who was state champion twice, actually 3 times, sophomore, junior, senior year. I was a little more interested in his sister, Chris, who was a really cute cheerleader, but that's a different story. And Johnny helped Comstock Park Panthers, I'm sure you've heard of them, right? Win the state championship in 1976. And now you can figure out how old I am if you didn't know. And but it was just a huge sport for us. My locker mate Dave Krasinski wrestled, and because of his complicated Polish name and his size, 250 pounds, his nickname was Crunch. Got a lot of pins. You know, it was just an amazing sport. I went to every match possible, and we had this, it brought out a lot of fans, but we had this particularly enthusiastic fan who was called the CP, Comstock Park, right? The CP lady. And she would watch the match, and her face and her body was a mirror reflection about what was happening on the wrestling mat. She would watch it. And the time when one of our wrestlers pulled a hamstring muscle, you would have thought it was hers. She was. So I tell you all this not because you care, but because, and not because you're all wrestlers athletically, but because spiritually we're all wrestlers. It's, you know, I don't want to know your weight class, please. You don't need to know mine, but it's our identity to be wrestlers. Here's why. The name Israel. Jacob's name was changed to Israel in the story. Israel, the church, is the new Israel. Israel means he or she who wrestles with God. So this morning, we want to think about what it means as God's people to be wrestlers. And if you weren't here last week, and you can find the sermon online at our website, but if you we're going through, as Mark's already said, the entire sweep of the Bible, Genesis to Revelation, in the 8 weeks during Epiphany. It's the teaching season of the church year. And today we're at covering really Genesis 12 through 50 to the end of Genesis. It's the period of the patriarchs and matriarchs of Israel. And in this, we're looking at these two stories, Jacob and Jacob's grandfather Abraham, particularly though the Jacob story, and trying to understand what does it mean to be he or to be a new Israel, he or she who wrestles with God. So I want to ask two questions. I always ask three. Today's two, special day. Hey, hey. First question is, why do we wrestle? And the second question is, what are we wrestling for? So first, why wrestle? And if you go back to Grandpa Abraham's story, you would think that Israel would have no need to wrestle. Because it begins in Genesis 12. Now this is as we understand, the historic part of the Bible. If you remember last week, we talked about Genesis 1:11 as being primeval history, whatever exactly that means. This is the historic part as we understand it, and now God is starting to renovate creation by developing a new people that God will bless, who will be a blessing. The chosen people who are chosen, so others will choose God. His chosen people who are blessed, so that the whole world will be blessed. And he chooses this couple, Abram and Sarai. It's their original names before their names were changed. And they grew up in Ur, Babylon, we might say Iraq today. They were rich Bedouin nomads, right? A lot of flocks, travel around wherever there was grazing for their flocks. And God chose them. And I don't know what that experience was like, but it was significant enough that Abram understood that they were infertile, that he and Sarah were going to have a son, and to continue on their line and take care of them when they got old, and they were going to have a new land of promise. And as desert nomads, this Canaan, Palestine, if you've ever been there, you know it's not the most beautiful land. It's very dusty and arid, even then. It probably was back then. But compared to where they had been wandering as desert nomads, it was a land, as they said in their words, flowing with milk and honey. It was beautiful. So there's this marvelous plan. And Abram's name is changed to Abraham, which means father of nations. And Sarai's name is changed to Sarah, which means princess. And so God gave them the sense that they were going to be, a nation was going to come out of them, and that would bless all of the nations. And so there's marvelous promise. And why would the early Israelite people be anything but grateful? But they wrestled. And so do we. And why do we wrestle? We wrestle because we want God's blessing, just like Jacob was wrestling in Peniel. We want, with God's messenger, we want God's blessing on our terms. That's what the story says. It's true of us. Grandpa Abraham and Sarah were promised the son, the father of nations. How could Abraham be the father of nations? How could Sarah be a princess without a son? And finally they waited. And years go by, over a decade goes by, and nothing happens. So what they finally try to get God's blessing on their terms. They take matters in their own hands. They follow an ancient custom. Sarah says, here, have my favorite servant Hagar, make a son with her. Abraham does that. The son's name is Ishmael, which you may understand the Muslims say that, father of Islam, right? And to this day, there's a consequence when we try to give God's blessing on our terms. To this day, bad Christians and Jews and Muslims still stab and shoot each other on a fairly regular basis. Didn't work out so well. Ishmael and Isaac didn't get along, and that's carried on to us. Well, and the same story could be told, God's blessings on our terms, of Jacob and his mother Rebekah. Right? In their day, what they wanted was Jacob and Esau were twins, and Esau was born just a little bit ahead of Jacob, so that he would be the firstborn, and the firstborn in that day got double the inheritance, because he had to take care of mom and dad when they got old, you know, Social Security pension kind of, and but he got double the inheritance. So Jacob was jealous. Jacob wanted it. So Jacob connived and deceived to try to get that firstborn status. It's called birthright. So one time, you can go back in the Genesis story and read this. They're maybe in their teens. Esau's a big hunter. He comes back famished from a hunt, and Jacob has got a plan. He creates, let's just say, his famous homemade chili. We don't know what it was, but the smell is wafting as hungry Esau comes in the house, and Esau says, "I want that, I'm hungry." And Jacob says, "Sure, you can have as much, I made it all for you, with just one condition. I want your birthright. I want double the inheritance." Dumb Esau says, "Okay, sure, just be chili and eat it." And then to cement that, right, Rebekah, the mother, Jacob was her favorite son over Esau. Isaac, the father, his favorite son was Esau. So, you know, they had a split already. You know how that works when mom and dad have different favorite kids. What a mess that makes. Well, Rebekah's favorite is Jacob. And she wants to cement it at the end of Isaac's life. When Father Isaac is blind, and will give his final blessing to his children, which will be sort of like, you know, the signature on the will that you get double inheritance. And Rebekah deceives with Jacob, and Esau's very hairy, so she puts animal skins on Jacob. She sends him into Isaac's room when Isaac's supposed to give the firstborn's blessing, and Isaac says, "Well, the voice is Isaac, Jacob, but the skin is Esau," and he gives the firstborn a blessing, and they got it. Firstborn, God's blessing on their own terms, double the inheritance. And what's the consequence? Well, for 20 years, the brothers Jacob and Esau do not talk, do not meet. And this wrestling match happens just before they're to meet for the first time in 20 years. We want God's blessing on our terms. That's the way I am, oftentimes. I want money without work, love without sacrifice, applause without effort. You know, aren't we always looking for a shortcut to Easy Street? And when you take it, it doesn't really get you there, does it? So we're all sometimes in relationships, in our jobs, at school, we're all trying to look for that shortcut, and it doesn't pan out so well. So why do we wrestle? We want God's blessing on our terms. So then what are we wrestling for? Kind of related, but a little bit different. Johnny Burdick was wrestling for the famous Comstock Park Panthers, right? He was wrestling for state championships for 3 years in a row. What do we wrestle for? Well, I'd say two things, right? We're wrestling, as I've already implied, to get God's blessing, and we're wrestling to share God's blessing. So first, wrestling to get God's blessing, to get our grubby paws on this blessing that God had promised Abraham. You know, I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. To Israel, Jacob wanted to live in that great blessing, but they struggled to get it. This is Sarah saying to old Abe, "Look, you know, I don't know what's happening. It's been 13 years or whatever the exact time period was. Just take Hagar. Let's make our own bundle of blessing." Or you know, it's you and I trying to find some sort of a shortcut. You know, it's hard to believe that God has our best interests in mind and that God's timing is just right. Those of you that know me know that I don't lose patience. right? Especially if you've been in meetings with me and we're trying to get something that I don't ooze patience. Matter of fact, oftentimes we agree on the goal, what it would be, what the blessing would be like for the church or for our lives, but we don't always agree on how to get there. And I think oftentimes of what St. Augustine said. St. Augustine said, pray as if everything depends upon God, but work as if everything depends upon you. Well, I'm better a lot of times at the latter than I am at the former, although I do pray, of course. So, always wrestling to try to figure this out. And the temptation that comes in my mind, and maybe in yours, because, you know, we're Americans, and you know, we're the entrepreneurial country, and we know that you can't just sit on the couch and wait for it to happen. You got to get off the couch and make it happen. And sometimes I get too impatient and I get off the couch too soon to try to make it happen and to arrange things or rearrange things. And while it doesn't often end up in a 20-year estrangement from a family member like Jacob and Esau, sometimes there's not the best consequences to that, and neither for you. Right? So on the one hand, we wrestle to get the blessing. And then lastly, we wrestle to share it. That's really why that messenger of God came and wrestled with Jacob all that night. Wanted not only to give Jacob a blessing, which Jacob demanded at the end of it dawned a new day, but also wanted Jacob to share the blessing, change his name to Israel, he or she who wrestles with God. Positive story. So Abraham, you can read about this in chapter 13, I think. Abraham and Lot, his nephew, their flocks are growing, they're prospering, the blessing of God is upon them. The land that they're grazing the flocks on is too small now for their abundance. So Abraham, the older of the two, has the right to choose the better land, takes Lot up to the top of a hill and gives Lot the choice. Says, okay, Lot, you want to go west or you want to go east? Wherever you go, I'll go the opposite way, and let's raise our flocks separate, and we'll have plenty of land. And Lot, of course, is greedy, and so he chooses the best land. And where is the best land? You've heard the name probably Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom was that town that was nuked because it raped strangers. There's a whole story behind that. You can read that too if you want, around Genesis 13 to 15 area. And Lot himself, probably because of his greed, rubbing shoulders with people who are so disrespectful, they rape strangers, that he almost got nuked with them. But Abraham intervened at the last minute. Here's where I think this is a share your blessings story. What I find is when I try to share my blessing with maybe those less fortunate, maybe, or even just take it in our families with our kids, sometimes I find that they don't use my blessing in the best way. Take kids. They're struggling with math, you get them the best tutor. They're struggling with their some stomach issues, you get them the best doctor. And then they go and they eat crap. They're good in a sport, you get them a good trainer, and sometimes they get lazy, and sometimes they don't use the blessing that you've given them in the best way, and it's frustrating, and you want to take it back, and maybe sometimes you should, and you don't want to let them just learn on their own because they're not learning, or whatever it is, right? We all struggle to share the blessing. We all struggle when we share the blessing. It's part of being God's people. He or she who wrestle with God. So where does that leave us? I sort of think that God likes feisty followers. I think God likes people who want to wrestle with God, who don't want to just, okay, God, whatever you want, but really get into it in prayer or thinking or struggle with God. But in the end, the best outcome is that we could end up with legs in the air, shoulder blades on the mat, pin. Now, we might push beyond that, and we might pull a hamstring or knock a hip out of joint, so that we have this reminder of how we're sometimes too feisty, as Jacob had. But as we mature and learn to surrender earlier to God's blessing and God's way, then we find that that's the way life should be. So, get pinned. Let's pray. God, we surrender to you again, wherever it is that we are struggling with your blessing. And we ask that you will help us to learn and to grow and to assert ourselves when important and to let go when important, and help us to learn the dance of wrestling with you. For it's in your name we pray, and all God's people say.